The fluorescent light above the teller's window hums at a frequency you feel in your back teeth. I am standing at the third window from the left at the Delmarva Savings branch on Rowan Street, and the teller, a young woman with a lanyard that says Priya, has stopped typing. Her fingers are still on the keyboard, not hovering. Still. The way fingers go still when the number on the screen doesn't match anything the brain was prepared to hold. My sister Claudette is standing 2 feet behind me. I can hear her breathing. Outside, it is 11 degrees and there is a thin skin of ice on the parking lot. And I had worn my good boots because I knew 5 years out that this day would eventually come, and I wanted to be wearing my good boots when it did. Priya looks up at me, then at the screen, then at me again. I don't say anything. I just wait. That is the thing about patience. Real patience, the kind that costs you something. It doesn't announce itself. It just stands there, in good boots, and lets the number on the screen do the talking. Welcome to Calm Revenge Tales. I'm glad you found this one. Stay with me to the end, because what happened in that bank didn't start there, and it didn't end there. And the person who mattered most in this story wasn't in the room when justice finally arrived. Subscribe if you want stories where the quiet ones win. Let's go back to the beginning. My name is Renata Voss. I am a licensed civil structural engineer. I have been one since I was 26 years old, when I passed my PE exam on the first attempt and framed the certificate myself, because I couldn't afford the $38 framing shop. And I had a miter box and a Sunday afternoon, and a habit of finishing what I start. I am also adopted. I have been adopted since I was 4 days old, when Harriet and George Voss brought me home from St. Agnes Hospital in Wilmington, Delaware, wrapped in a yellow blanket that Harriet had knitted herself in the last weeks of her pregnancy. Her other pregnancy, the biological one, the one that had produced my sister Claudette 11 months earlier. Harriet was 41 when she adopted me. She had already had one child. She hadn't needed another. She had wanted one. That distinction, needed versus wanted, is one Claudette never quite forgave. I should tell you about Nana Voss. About Elspeth. Elspeth Voss was George's mother. She was 81 years old when my parents died, both of them 6 weeks apart, my father to a stroke in February and my mother to what the doctors called a broken heart and what the death certificate called cardiac arrest in March. Elspeth had come to live with my parents after my grandfather died, 12 years prior. She had her own room at the end of the hall. She took her tea with 2 sugars and a splash of whole milk. She called me Rennie. She called Claudette Claudie. But when she said Claudie, it sounded the way you'd say the name of a weather system. When she said Rennie, she sounded like she was setting something down gently. Claudette had always been the one my parents praised out loud. She was the one they talked about at dinner parties. The decorator. The socialite. The one who had married a man named Preston who wore boat shoes indoors and had opinions about wine that he delivered as though they were verdicts. I was the one who showed up with my truck when the furnace broke. The one who replaced the back steps when they rotted through. The one who sat with Elspeth on Sunday afternoons while she talked about George as a boy, about the smell of the house she grew up in, about a recipe for apple cake that she had never written down because she had never needed to. Elspeth always knew where I kept my spare key. I always knew where she kept her heart medication. My parents died on a Thursday and a Tuesday in that order, and by the following Sunday Claudette had called a family meeting in what had been my parents' living room. She had already moved 4 boxes of my mother's things to the garage. She had already called a real estate agent. She had already, I would later learn, consulted a probate lawyer about the will. The meeting was in the living room. Elspeth's door was closed. Preston sat in my father's chair. I noticed that. I didn't say anything about it. Claudette stood near the fireplace and said the house would need to be sold, that the estate was straightforward, that as the biological child she believed she had a stronger claim to the family heirlooms, and that she was sure I understood. I said I understood just fine. Then she said the other thing. She said that the house had always really been meant to stay in the family, meaning the biological family, meaning she had already spoken to a lawyer about whether my adoption affected my inheritance rights, and that she thought it would be cleaner. That was the word she chose, cleaner, if I stepped back from the process and let her handle things. Preston nodded. He had a glass of my father's scotch in his hand. He had not offered any to anyone else. I looked at Claudette for a long moment. I had known her for 33 years. I had been in her wedding. I had held her hand in the waiting room when she'd miscarried. I had painted her spare bedroom a color called Whispering Wheat on a weekend when Preston was golfing. I looked at her the way you look at a house you've just watched a fire leave. Then I asked if Elspeth had been included in this conversation. Claudette said Elspeth wasn't part of the estate. I said that wasn't what I had asked. Claudette said, and I will not forget the particular flatness of her voice when she said it, that Elspeth could stay in the house until it sold. After that, she'd need to make other arrangements. Elspeth was 81 years old. She had lived in that house for 12 years. She had a heart condition, and a doctor on Maple Street she'd seen every 6 weeks for 4 years, and a rosebush in the backyard that she pruned herself every September. I stood up. I said, then I'll make other arrangements too. Claudette looked genuinely surprised. I think she had expected a negotiation. I went down the hall and knocked on Elspeth's door. She was sitting in her reading chair by the window, the one with the pale blue upholstery that had faded to almost white. She was holding a small framed photograph of George as a young man, looking at it the way you look at a thing you are trying to memorize before it's taken from you. She looked up at me. I said, "Pack what you need for tonight. We'll get the rest later." She said, "Are you sure?" I said, "I'm sure." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your mother always said you were the steady one." I didn't answer that. I just helped her up and handed her her coat. I had a house. It was mine. I had bought it 7 years earlier with a down payment I'd saved over 4 years of eating lunch at my desk and not taking vacations. And it was a narrow 2-story on Aldermore Lane with a kitchen that got good morning light, and a spare room I had been using as a drafting space. I moved the drafting table into the living room in a single afternoon. I put Elspeth in the spare room. I drove back to the house on Maple Street 3 times over the following 2 weeks, moving her things in my truck, the blue upholstered chair, her books, the rosebush in its pot. The rosebush did not love being moved. For 6 weeks it dropped leaves and refused to bloom. I watered it every other day. I talked to it eventually, when I was sure Elspeth couldn't hear. I told it that I knew the feeling. The first month cost me an extra $420, a hospital bed rail I had installed in Elspeth's room after she stumbled once in the night, a second drawer unit for the bathroom, the increase in groceries. I adjusted my grocery budget, and I canceled the streaming service I hadn't watched in 2 months anyway. I did not adjust anything else. Claudette called twice. The first time, she said the house had a buyer and I would be receiving a check for my portion of the estate, and that she hoped we could put this unpleasantness behind us. The amount she named was $42,000. I thanked her and hung up. The second time, she called to tell me that a distant cousin had offered to take Elspeth, that there was a lovely assisted living facility in Rehoboth, that I could have my spare room back, that she was only thinking of my quality of life. I said, "I appreciate the thought." She said, "Renata, she's not your family." I said, "I know you believe that." She hung up. There is a folder that Elspeth kept in the bottom drawer of her blue chair. The chair I had moved from the house on Maple Street. A manila folder, the kind you buy in a pack of 25 and use for tax documents and instruction manuals. She kept it with a rubber band around it, and she moved it herself every time she settled somewhere new. The way you'd carry a thing too important to pack. I saw her take it out once, in those early months, sitting at the kitchen table with her tea while I was making dinner. She looked at it for a long time without opening it. Then she put the rubber band back on, and set it on the table beside her cup like a coaster. I made chicken paprikash that night. My mother's recipe. Elspeth ate 2 bowls. She said, "Your mother taught you the right way with paprika. Not everyone knows the right way." I said I'd learned by watching. She said that was how she'd learned everything that mattered. If you're still watching and this story is doing something to you, if you're thinking about someone in your life who deserved more than they got, subscribe so the rest of the story finds you. It's about to change. Elspeth died in the spring. It was a Tuesday, early before the light had fully come in. She had been declining for 3 weeks. I had arranged for a home health aide named Dorothea to come every morning, and I had rearranged my site visits so I could work from home in the afternoons. On her last full day, she asked me to open the window. I opened it. The rosebush was blooming. She could see it from her bed. She said, "Rennie." I said, "I'm here." She said, "The folder in the drawer. You keep it." I said, "Okay." She said, "George always said the right things ended up with the right people. He was right about most things." I held her hand until Dorothea arrived. Then I went to my desk and I did not cry, because crying was not what the moment required. What the moment required was that I file a change of address form for her prescriptions, and call her doctor, and call the county and call the funeral home. So that is what I did. I did not call Claudette. Claudette found out from Preston's cousin, who had seen the obituary notice. She called. I let it go to voicemail. She left a message that lasted 40 seconds and included the phrase "she was family to all of us," which I listened to exactly once before I deleted it. I opened the folder 2 weeks after the funeral. I had been stepping around it, setting it on the kitchen table and moving it away, waiting for the right moment, though I couldn't have said what would make a moment right. Inside the folder was a document. A letter on legal stationery from a firm in Wilmington, a certificate of amendment to a trust, and a handwritten note in Elspeth's handwriting, 3 lines, dated 4 years earlier. The note said, "Rennie came back for me when she didn't have to. That is the oldest kind of family. I have tried to say thank you the only way I know how." The trust had been amended 3 years before Elspeth's death. The original beneficiaries had been her 2 children and her grandchildren, divided by thirds. The amendment designated a new primary beneficiary for her personal estate. My name. Her personal estate included the house on a small property in Dover that she had never mentioned. A house her own mother had left her, separate from anything involving George or the Voss family. A house that had appreciated. A house that, plus a savings account I had not known existed and a whole life insurance policy with a cash value of $214,000, brought the total to just under $1.1 million. I called the law firm. They already knew who I was. They said they had been waiting for my call. The meeting was scheduled for 2 weeks later in Wilmington. The firm had notified all interested parties. Claudette was there when I arrived. Preston was there. The attorney, a man named Solomon Ease, was at the head of the table. He was calm and precise and wore a tie the color of a good burgundy. Solomon read the trust documents aloud. When he reached the amendment, Claudette's jaw shifted. It shifted the way a structure shifts under unexpected load. Not dramatic, just the smallest translation of wait. Then Preston said loudly that this was not legal, that Elspeth had been in declining health, that undue influence was a recognized legal concept, and he would be making calls. Claudette pressed both palms flat on the table. Her palms went completely flat, like she was trying to push the table down through the floor. Solomon said the amendment had been executed and witnessed 3 years before any cognitive decline, by 2 attorneys and a notary, and that it was unambiguous and uncontested. Then there was a pause. And in that pause I watched Claudette's assistant, a young woman named Merritt who had driven them to Wilmington and sat near the door, look at her own hands. Not at Claudette. At her own hands. She folded them very carefully in her lap. I placed the manila folder on the table. I pushed it to the center. I said, Elspeth kept this herself. For 4 years. She moved it every time she moved. I think she knew what she was doing. I said, she told me once that the right things end up with the right people. She learned that from George. I think she was saying it to herself as much as to me. Claudette looked at me. For the first time in a long time, her face did something unguarded. Something that was not quite grief and not quite shame. Something that looked more like recognition. Like she was seeing something she had always known was true, and had been working very hard not to see. I did not look away. But I also did not press it. I have carried the memory of that moment the way you carry a tool you hope never to need again. Carefully, and without pride. The estate settled in 97 days. Solomon Ease's firm handled the transfer. The house in Dover was sold. The accounts were transferred. The documents were signed and witnessed and filed. Claudette did file a contest. Her attorney wrote 4 letters. Solomon's firm responded to each one with the relevant documentation. On the 4th response, Claudette's attorney stopped writing. I did not hear from Claudette again for 9 months. When I did, it was a letter. Handwritten. 6 paragraphs. In the 5th paragraph she said she had been wrong about the family line. She said she knew it did not undo what she had done. She asked if we could speak. I wrote back. 1 paragraph. I said that I had no interest in being owed an apology, and no interest in pretending that the past 8 years had not happened, but that I also had no interest in carrying this, and that if she ever needed something real, she could call. She has not called. I keep the letter. I am not sure why, except that it is true, and truth has a weight to it, and I have learned to respect weight. I did not keep the $42,000. I donated it to the St. Agnes Hospital Pediatric Unit in my mother's name. I don't know why exactly, except that St. Agnes was where Harriet had brought me home from, and it seemed like the right way to say thank you to a woman who had wanted me when she hadn't needed to. The house on Aldermore Lane is mine. The drafting table is back in the spare room. The room Elspeth slept in is still painted the color she chose. A pale yellow she called just about right. The rosebush bloomed again that spring. It bloomed red and full, and without being asked. On a Sunday morning in late April, I made chicken paprikash from memory. My mother's recipe. Not too much paprika. Not too little. I ate alone at the kitchen table, with the window open and the smell of the yard coming in. And I thought about how Elspeth had said I knew the right way. I thought about how knowing the right way is not something anyone can deed to you or contest or take to court. You learn it by watching. You learn it by coming back when you don't have to. You learn it in kitchens, at bedsides, on Sunday afternoons when no one is keeping score. Which is how I came to be standing at that teller's window on Rowan Street, on a day 11 degrees cold, with Claudette behind me for reasons I will not explain here except to say that even imperfect people sometimes need someone steady. Priya looked at the number on the screen, and then at me, and her fingers went still. I waited. I have gotten good at waiting. She cleared her throat. She said, Ms. Voss, how would you like to proceed? I said carefully. And with the right paperwork. She nodded. She began to type. If someone gave you something, not money, not things, but a way of being in the world, make sure they know you got it. Call them. Not later. Today. Tell them you got it. If this story meant something to you, share it with the person who taught you how to stay. Leave a comment with one word. What else Beth would have meant in your life. And subscribe, because there are more stories like this one, and I want them to find you. I'll see you in the next one.